venerable members of the Sangha, distinguished guests, friends in the Dharma. It's wonderful to see you all here today for the 100th anniversary lecture series in Japanese Buddhism. And those of you who came for the first lectures will, on Pure Land, will remember Tairo's 3 lectures which he gave. And this follows almost logically after that, which is 3 more talks on Zen Buddhism. The talks will last approximately 1 hour, after which time there will be a short interval where you can ask questions, and then we will have a reception downstairs, and you're almost welcome to come and join in and meet Thomas. And I'm sure you'll be too pleased to talk to you. But I should tell you a little bit about Tom. I had the good fortune to meet Tom some years ago in Kyoto, and he was very generous, and Darcy and I stayed in his beautiful temple. He was the most wonderful host and made me feel comfortable with all sorts of things which would have been very difficult for me to have sort of grasped. And it's a great honor, really, for us to have you with us, Tom, tonight to talk on this particular subject. And we were thinking that maybe those of you who are interested, and if you are interested, we could follow up these 3 talks with maybe a couple of seminars online in which we could ask further questions, and that could be done when Tom gets back to Japan. But I think actually while Tom is here, we won't be able to do that. But those of you who are interested, just let us know. And I think online seminars would be a very valuable thing to do. And Tyra might be interested in also having some seminars on his talks as well. Yes?
I'll talk.
Yeah. Anyway, Tom was born in America, in Maryland, in 1949. He went to Japan in 1969 to study at Waseda University in Tokyo, after which he practiced Zen as a lay monk at Shofukuji Monastery under Yamadi Mumon Roshi, a most gifted teacher. Following ordination in 1974, he trained at the monasteries Kenchoji in Kamakura and Keninji in Kyoto for 7 years. He later obtained an MA in Buddhist Studies at Otani University, Research Institute for Zen Buddhism in Kyoto. Among his publications are the Record of Linji, Entangling Vines, a classic collection of Zen koans, and Dialogues in a Dream, the life and Zen teaching of Muso Soseki. And this last book was reviewed in the Middle Way, and those of you who are interested can look back at the Middle Way and look at that review. It's a wonderful book, and Entangling Vines. But as far as the Record of Linji goes, those of Zen students here who are followers of Myokyoni will remember the Record of Rinzai, the small, slim volume she produced. Well, that was produced by a professor, who was working on the project for quite a long time in Kyoto. But when the sort of main kind of power behind the translation work actually died, the mass of collected papers and so on, Ruth Fuller Suzaki's papers, were left in some chaos, and they lingered for many, many years untouched. But it was because Tom I don't know where the initiative came from, but Tom put the whole thing together into this really quite wonderful book, The Record of Linji, which is the Record of Rinzai, one should say, which is the full annotated version with lots and lots of notes and everything. Wonderful piece of work. And I must say, when it did come out, it was a very gratifying thing to do, because it had lingered so long in the dark. And what's the point of teachings, especially work that had been done, if it can't be read and enjoyed and stimulate people? Tom, thank you so much for coming all the way from Japan. And a big welcome to your wife, who's here with you. And Tyra, you might just want to say a word of introduction as well.
Introduction?
Yours, Tyra, for Tom. Just say a few words. But the first lecture now is on suffering, something that we all know about, and Tom will go into that.
Nothing special, but my friendship, very long-standing friendship with Tom-san. I call him Tom-san. And I met him nearly 50 years ago at Hotei University. I was working as one of the editorial board of the Eastern Buddhist, which was the magazine established by D.T. Suzuki and his wife Beatrice. And we worked together, translating D.T. Suzuki's talks and articles. And I was so surprised to see his translation of D.T. Suzuki's difficult sentences, Japanese sentences. He was able to translate the very delicate nuances of D.T. Suzuki's Japanese essays and sentences. And it's not easy at all, because of his long life in monasteries. Zen monk. Before I came to UK, I have gathered Tom Thompson, was a Western monk who had longest training at Zen monasteries. And based on his deep experience, that he could digest the content of these writings and books. And I was able to translate these books successfully together with him. And I was very happy. I met, and also he translated my articles very kindly, wonderful talks. I still use his wonderful sentences in my talks. I gave some talks at Buddhist Society, and a tiny bit of it was his own expression about it to explain Zen Buddhism. What is Zen Buddhism in contrast to pure Buddhism? So what he is such a person, and he is more important. He went through the strict Zen trainings. He is very kind, full of love. He's monk, very kind and full of love. One of my best friends. So I am very happy. Today is the most happy days of my life to have. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I hardly know what to say after those introductions. You both are entirely too kind. I would like to say, of course, first of all, congratulations on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the London Buddhist Society. It's amazing for any society to last 100 years is quite remarkable. So I feel I'm the one who feels honored to have been asked to give these talks. I have the pleasure of being introduced to a number of you downstairs, and as I was commenting to Dr. Budolf's wife, Darcy, with each successive introduction, I was feeling more intimidated because you obviously are a highly learned and practiced group. But on the other hand, I look forward to any piercing questions you might have after the talk. People ask if I'm a Zen master, which might be expected after the amount of time I've been in Japan. I've been there, lived in Japan for 55 years now, and 10 of those years were in formal Zen monasteries. But becoming a Zen master, particularly in the Rinzai school, is quite a heavy lift, and I'm nowhere near that. I would say that I spent a lot of my time in the monastery in fruitless attempts to force silence upon my mind, but pretty much the entire 55 years, just through a series of various coincidental encounters, etc., I pretty much stayed within the orbit of the Rinzai Zen world. I presently live at the temple Tenryuji, a large Zen monastery on the western edge of Kyoto. And just over the years, I mean, I regard myself actually as a person of rather ordinary accomplishments, but even someone like me, you know, with continued meditation, I think you can find this to be an extremely rewarding and even transformative practice. And it's in that position that I would like to talk to you today. I will be talking, as the introductory material mentioned, on the subject of suffering. I have a fair amount of material to cover, and I don't know any other way to cover it without forgetting stuff, and otherwise, you know, thinking back after I finish that, oh, I should have mentioned this, without actually reading the paper. I'll try to do it in as least wooden and hopefully entertaining way to do that. Maybe add a few comments as I go along if they strike me. I should first of all say, though, that I say it's the title of the talk is Zen and the Question of Suffering. When I use the word Zen, it's more in its, I think, broader original sense of meditation. As I'm sure you all know, I mean, Zen originates in the word dhyana, which means meditation in the Indian languages. And when Buddhism moved into China, China adopted that word, pronounced it as channa, it was shortened to chan, which is pronounced Zen in Japanese. So the word Zen means, you know, it does mean meditation. So the Zen school of meditation is the meditation school of Buddhism. I would like to talk about the meditation, however, not as restricted to the Zen school proper, but more in the sense of, you know, general Buddhist meditation. I will, of course, talk about, you know, Zen meditation itself. But I do notice that recently, I mean, I've been to Korea, for example, and noticed that the monks there, now that transportation is so much easier than it was throughout most of the history of Buddhism, there's a lot of kind of cross-fertilization going on. Korean monks, very, very interested in Southeast Asian Buddhism, interested in Tibetan Buddhism, for example. So I think, you know, including, you know, what these traditions might have to offer to the practice of meditation does fit in a very genuine way into a talk about, you know, Zen and the question of suffering. Suffering, of course, is central to Buddhism. This was the issue that drove Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, to his practice, leaving, you know, the royal palace that he was raised in. But I think that many of us Westerners tend to feel a certain resistance to this idea when we're first introduced to Buddhism. I know that my feeling, you know, when I first started studying Buddhism in the university was, yeah, I mean, there's suffering. I mean, that's why I'm interested in Buddhism anyway, but, you know, why the focus on that? You know, there's pleasure too. We shouldn't be focusing so much on the negative side of things. And I think it was maybe partly this feeling that made me interested in Zen in the beginning, because Zen has this emphasis more, you know, I felt, okay, I already know about suffering. I want to find out about what to do about it. And, you know, maybe there is a resolution to this. And Zen tends to talk a little bit more about this. Maybe, of course, traditional Buddhism does very much as also, but Zen with its kind of interesting koans and talk about satori and these experiences. I think that element comes forward perhaps a little bit more. But at any rate, I think that was one of the big things. Plus, I was very fortunate to have met, even while I was in America, one Zen person who really very deeply impressed me, and that was Shibayama Zenkei Roshi, the former chief abbot at the monastery Nanzenji in Kyoto. And he was spending 2 years as a visiting professor at Colgate College in America and traveling around America at the time and giving introductory talks on Buddhism in various colleges. And I couldn't understand a word he said. I mean, he had a very good translator with him, so the language wasn't a problem, but I had nothing to relate it to. But I was extremely moved by his persona, his being, there was a kind of a warmth there, a feeling that this is someone who really understood you. Didn't get the feeling he was trying to sell you anything. So this is another thing. I think it was after I met him that I started thinking concretely about going to Japan and studying. So I took advantage of a junior year broad program, and just as Dr. Rudolph expressed, one thing led to another. Doing Zen all those years, of course, as I said, there is a certain resistance that I think a lot of Westerners have to this idea, the central place it seems to have in Buddhism. But even with regard to Zen, as the years went by, I came to realize that even with Zen, Shakyamuni's original teachings on, the fact of human suffering and what we should do to address it, it pretty much said it all. And that made me interested much more in a lot of the original teachings. So I think the issue of suffering, I mean, it's certainly not limited to Buddhism. All religions have it, I'm sure. For example, I think theistic religions like Christianity, when they consider the question of suffering, which they do, it's regarded as being caused in large part by a misguided relationship with the divine. Our relationship with God is out of balance, so therefore the spiritual path is one of rectifying this relationship with that which transcends the human. I think Buddhism too has this aspect of the divine. I mean, comes out of the tradition of Indian spirituality, which has a very, very strong sense of the divine, of course. But certainly at the time of Shakyamuni, and I think it's true of Zen in particular, there's more of a concern with what I might call the human side of the equation. In other words, what is it about the human mind? What is it about human existence itself that gives rise to this sense of suffering? I think, well, first of all, suffering. It may be one of the problems I think that we Westerners may have with this concept of suffering is that it only expresses one aspect of the original word that was used, which was dukkha, a much more general term than the English word suffering, as I'm sure you all know. I heard that it has its linguistics origin in the axis of a cart that doesn't quite fit right, and it's like the bumpy road of life. So it covers everything from, generally satisfied people who basically have everything they want, just got the new car, but 4 days later they're always, they're looking for the next thing. Why is it that we seem to be so incapable of finding a happiness that is free of conditions? And dukkha goes from there, to covering the terrible suffering that a lot of people are going through every day. People that are in depression, which can lead to terrible results, undergoing the deprivations of war, this very day. So I think there are a lot of people that even in the modern world today, who do share the Buddha's original emphasis on suffering, I think. Certainly the people that are motivated to leave the comforts of, secular modern life and enter monasteries with all their, physical deprivations and spiritual challenges. I think these people are driven by a very strong sense of this deep-rooted suffering that seems to accompany human resistance. So in part, when the Buddha talked about life is dukkha, it was, basically just a statement of how life actually feels for the type of people who take up the path of spiritual practice. I mean, these are the sort of people that would have gathered around Shakyamuni and formed his original community. But I also think that pretty much all of us, ordinary people, certainly people as we get older, accumulate all of the experiences that life in the world involves, we become more and more aware of the kind of underlying current of suffering in our lives, which so often we, exert a lot of energy and time in trying to deny, ignore, or distract ourselves from, but ultimately are unable to do so. The late, great Indian philosopher Krishnamurti, I think he actually spoke here probably. He had a certain connection with the society, I think. Yeah, he had a statement that really struck me when I read it. He said, "We live on the edge of sorrow." I think we see this undercurrent of suffering, not only in the inescapable the inescapable facts of life that the Buddha talked about. The fact that we will all lose the people we love, the fact that we will all have to suffer old age, sickness, and death. But maybe more to the point, I think most of the suffering that we undergo in life, certainly, as we are still relatively young and healthy, it's the tensions and the anxieties and the interpersonal frictions that we experience in our everyday lives. The ego conflicts and the defending of me versus that which is not me, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think another aspect of the Buddhist teachings on dukkha was to sensitize people to this underlying unease and suffering in life, so that we might reorder our priorities to address the true causes of this suffering. Buddhism, basically, this is a very basic teaching that I'm sure you're all aware of, but it sees the roots of our suffering as lying in the very nature of existence. Buddhism, it loves to make lists, of the various essential points that form its thought system. So these basic elements of existence, they summarize in the 3 points, the 3 marks of existence. These are the 3 essential features that characterize all of life, certainly all of life as a human being. First of all, what I've just been talking about, the fact that dukkha, that life is characterized by various degrees of unsatisfactoriness. Number 2, anicca, usually translated as impermanence, the fact that all phenomena are transitory. And number 3, anicca, usually translated as non-self, the fact that nothing possesses an unchanging substance or essence. So I've already talked a fair amount about dukkha. So what about the first of these marks of existence that I mentioned? Anatta, impermanence. Anicca, impermanence. Much of our suffering, according to Buddhism, occurs because our existence is fundamentally transitory. And this is another thing I think that can be understood on several levels. I think there is a kind of a basic, general, everyday level. which is our tendency to seek happiness and satisfaction in certain things not changing. The average person, for example, is looking for security and what they regard as happiness in their good health, in their social status, financial security, the possession of cherished objects. But these things, these sort of things that we ordinarily seek happiness in, always do change. I mean, our health declines, we inevitably lose the people we love, and we must eventually, let go of everything that we have obtained and that we create. So as long as we look for happiness in the conditioned world of things that is always subject to change, I mean, this includes not only material things, but I think also concepts and ideas. Ultimately, we're seeking in happiness in that which can never provide it. I think this level of anicca, I mean, what I would call the ordinary understanding of anicca, what we'd say, this too shall pass away, which in itself is a very profound teaching, I think. But this level, I think, for the world renouncer, again, is enough to set them out on a spiritual search. I mean, the idea that they think of any possible job they could do, anything it might create will eventually not exist anymore. So what is it that is eternal? I think, though, that there's a deeper sense of this, again, I mean, this is a very valuable and genuine meaning of transiency, but I think there's a deeper sense as well, particularly when we get to Mahayana Buddhism. That sense is that the fundamental characteristic of all existence is that nothing is in an unchanging state for even the briefest instant of time. Everything, this desk, whatever I have here, it seems to be unchanging, seems to be very permanent and solid, but according to Buddhist teaching, at its deepest level, everything is in a state of constant change. But when we think about it, this is precisely what modern physics is telling us. If we really look into the essence of things. Well, actually, this point was sort of brought home to me especially. I used to give talks to an organization called the Elder Hostel. I don't know if you had that. It was a group of generally retired professionals, academics, people who wanted to travel but wanted to make an educational experience of this. So I was asked to give talks on Buddhism and mentioned this idea of impermanence. And after the talk, an elderly gentleman came up and introduced himself as a retired physicist. And he said that as a physicist, he's quite interested in this Buddhist view of impermanence. And mentioned that in physics, he said, one of the difficulties in researching subatomic particles is they're never actually there to be studied in an unchanging state. Always like an electron is always winking in and out of existence. So you have to make guesses and estimates about it. So, I mean, looking at it from this perspective, if we're seeking happiness and meaning in certain things remaining the same, I mean, dissatisfaction is inevitable because we're going against the very deepest fabric of existence. The flip side of this, of course, is if we truly experience this impermanent nature, this ever-changing nature of things, and see that this impermanence is the essential nature of things, even on a moment-to-moment basis, and that we ourselves are an integral part of this process. Well, this makes it possible for a happiness less constrained by conditions and attachments. There's actually, I'll talk about this later, but a form of meditation that uses this as a way to address the question of suffering. The third of the three marks of existence, anatman, again, another of the root causes of suffering, Buddhism teaches that one of the greatest sources of our suffering as human beings is that we have a false notion of who we are. I mean, our usual sense of self, which seems to us, particularly I think as Westerners, because we live in a society where there's all sorts of like competing thought systems and value systems and, worldviews. In order to successfully navigate the waters of modern society, we have to have a well-grounded and hopefully, healthy, balanced sense of self. So again, this is another teaching, the teaching of no self, like Anicca, is one that we Westerners, with a strong and often very clear sense of self, tend to feel a bit of resistance to. But here too, it was very interesting to me to find out that in modern psychology, they have a very, very similar idea to the notion of ego that they have classically had in Buddhism. As psychology sees it, the self is a kind of a story or a narrative that we tell about ourselves. Like, we're born in a certain country, we absorb the values and worldviews of a certain culture. We're taught certain things by our parents and acquaintances. We have a whole range of experiences, depending on how we look and how smart we are, and just sheer coincidence. And this leaves us as the years go by as we grow up with this huge collection of memories, impressions, beliefs, values, assumptions, grudges, and all of this stuff about who we are and what the world is. And at some point in our maturation, we synthesize all of this into a story. Well, basically, psychology calls it a narrative about who we are and what the world is. And this narrative is what we identify as being my ego. Now, I think there's a lot of talk in Buddhism. There's an old joke. The Buddhist master asked, can you summarize what Buddhism is all about in a single sentence? And I said, oh, that's easy. I can do it in 4 words. No self, no problem. The suggestion is that somehow Buddhism is dismissing the ego. But I think that's a misunderstanding. I mean, you cannot function in the complex world we live in without, again, a hopefully healthy and balanced sense of ego. So Buddhism recognizes the importance of the ego. The problem, as Buddhism sees it, is that the ego, for most people, is all that they know of the self. They allow this thought construct, they allow this narrative to entirely define who they are. So what we end up doing is basically identifying ourselves with thought. We are allowing thought, our identification with thought, to construct this thing that we call me. And this identification with thought causes suffering in many ways. Now, before I proceed any further, I think it's important to say that not all thought is part of the problem. What psychology calls task-oriented thought. I mean, we have this wonderful human mind, we have problems that come up, and we use the mind to resolve problems. This is a here and now use of the mind. And this is our greatest gift as human beings. I mean, we have this to thank for the many, many gifts of civilization. According to psychology, what causes the problems? According to Buddhism, I think there's a very similar outlook. Is not this what psychology calls the task-oriented thought, but what it calls default thinking. This is the kind of thinking that wells up unbidden when the mind is not directed to a specific task. Sort of thing, that comes to mind when we're taking a walk or washing the dishes or, whenever the mind doesn't have to do something specific. And the problem is, here again, I think the teachings of psychology shed a lot of light on this. That kind of thinking is not always, but very often negative, because negative experiences tend to impress themselves much more strongly on our psyche than positive experiences. This is another finding of psychology. And there's an evolutionary reason for that. You know, we do not want to repeat negative, dangerous, you know, experiences. So we remember them more strongly. This means, though, that many of the thoughts that do well up, again, tend to be negative. You know, that time I still remember unpleasant experiences I had 30 years ago. And if you're not careful, you can end up like replaying these things like a broken record, you know, again and again in your mind. I think often these kind of negative experiences, the experience itself is not the problem. It's because we tend to go over and over again. It's very, very ego gratifying. You know, I was so right, that person was so wrong. Or the opposite, I was so wrong. How dare that person have said that? You know, all of the sort of things that we can go over. And with these, you know, replaying this, the negative effect on our psyche deepens. So, this is one of the problems, I think, with identifying with thoughts, that, you know, this leads to human suffering. Another problem, I think, with divining ourself by our narrative is that anything that threatens that narrative becomes a source of suffering, of danger. I mean, this can be anything. You know, we have images of ourselves. You know, I'm a good-looking person, I'm a smart person, or whatever. And anything that comes along, it can just be a passing insult, you know, that shows that not everybody agrees with that opinion. This can be quite painful. All the way up to, you know, like threats to our worldview. If, you know, our view of the world and what it's all about and what it's for is shaped by a certain viewpoint. If a competing worldview comes along, I mean, in the worst case, this is what leads religions to go to war with each other. Competing worldview that's just strong as yours. Another problem, I've just got a couple more, but this is kind of a very interesting issue for me. If our thoughts turn dark, I mean, I've noticed with myself, I don't think anybody goes into a monastic vocation, certainly not a contemplative monastic vocation, without a few good thumping depressions. If your thought goes into a downward spiral, it can be very, very hard to disidentify from this. And, you know, again, in the worst case, this is what leads to suicide, other tragic consequences. Another thing that I think is really worth mentioning is thought can take things that are just facts and turn them into suffering. I think a really good example of this is pain. I mean, pain itself is not suffering. Pain is your body telling you that there's something wrong and you should be doing something about it. But we resist this with thought. Why is this happening to me? Oh, this is because I did something wrong, or this is because that person, you know. We come up with all of these thoughts that we apply to the fact of pain, and we end up turning pain into suffering. I've heard it expressed as suffering equals pain times resistance. But this also happens with pleasure as well. I mean, pleasure is just, it's a fact. It's your body telling you that you're doing something your body wants it to do, like eating, for example. But then we add thought to this, you know. That dessert was really good. I think I'll have another one. And by clinging to pleasure, we end up turning pleasure into suffering as well. There's one final thing that I would like to discuss in my talk on Zen, what Zen has to learn from Christianity. And that's a kind of thought that actually can be quite helpful in the spiritual life. Very, very related to thought, but the dark night of the soul. But anyway, I will leave that for that talk. What does this connection between impermanence and suffering have to do with meditation? And as it is, as I touched upon a moment ago, there are meditation systems that actually use these facts of existence as ways to directly address the issue of suffering. First of all, well, address, resolve. I should say, I think right here that I think people have the idea that Buddhism is about eliminating the question of suffering. I think certainly for ordinary people, this is not possible. You know, we live in a conditioned world, so we're always dealing with it. Resolving suffering, I think, means learning to deal with suffering in a way that contributes to our growth as human beings rather than tearing us down. I think proceeding on, to the meditation methods with regard to anicca, meditation systems that use impermanence as a route to addressing suffering, to resolving suffering. I think the best known one, certainly nowadays, may be the Vipassana tradition of Ubakin and Goenka. Again, I'll discuss this later. And with regard to the issue of anatman, probably, all forms of Buddhist meditation, certainly, in one way or another, address this issue. Even, certainly, Goenka's system does as well. What I would like to describe in particular, because it's one that worked quite well for me, and which I think shows a lot of the essential elements that goes into this approach of addressing, Atman as a thought creation. And this is the system taught by an American Zen teacher named Shinzen Young. Very, very interesting and thoughtful person I have found. As a starting point, however, both of these systems, and again, I think any system that is used in Buddhist meditation, as a starting point, they use meditation techniques that address what the American writer Mark Twain called the storm of thoughts that is constantly blowing through our mind. Our lives do not consist mainly of doings and happenings. Our lives consist mainly of the storm of thoughts that is continually blowing through our minds. So what do we do about that at first? And these are basically approaches that, in one way or another, are similar, quite similar to what is presently known as mindfulness. I know that mindfulness is a little bit, it's attracted some criticism, and I'd like to address that in my other talk on Buddhism. But just quickly going over the basics. The mindfulness meditation, as I'm sure you all know, is be in the present moment. Right here, right now. I think this is pretty much basic, though, to all forms of meditation, even Christian meditation. There is something I have heard from my Christian monk friends known as the sacrament of the present moment. Another thing I want to go into a little bit more. The present moment is a sacrament because the only time that God can manifest in your life is the present moment. So the more we are in the present moment, the more opportunity we're giving to the divine to manifest in our life. The reason for this stress on the present moment is that thought, which, as I was mentioning before, is at the root of a lot of our suffering. Thought is always of the past or the future. This is something that Krishnamurti also emphasized a lot. Something happens, we think, what's going on? So we're in the past. We think, what should I do? And we're projecting the past onto what hasn't happened yet. If we're completely in the present, and I want to stress, if we're completely in the present in a kind of a relaxed and open and accepting way, there's basically no thought there. This is just presence, it's being. This is not easy to access, though. I think we are so accustomed to this fact of identifying with thought that remaining in the present moment is quite difficult. I think anyone who's tried meditation, has experienced that, except for a few naturals who do exist. Meditation, therefore, it usually begins on as simple a concrete a level as possible, with awareness of the concrete, of physical sensations. So, for example, I can feel my hands on the podium here, or my butt against the seat. You can feel probably, feeling on the floor through your shoes, et cetera, what we are feeling right now. If we're completely in the present moment with these sensations in an open and accepting, relaxed way, then this is already a kind of meditation. Something we can basically do anytime and anywhere. Now, I stress relaxation. This is a big point. As I mentioned, I think I squandered a lot of my years in the monastery by trying to force states of silence on an unwilling mind. Relaxation is something I really stress because tension is always a form of resistance. If you're tense, you're resisting something. If you're trying to meditate by blocking out the past and the future and like keeping yourself in this little box that you call the present moment, you're resisting reality. The mind is always moving. If you try to stifle a thought when it comes up, what you end up doing is creating a thought of silence and using that as a kind of lid to keep all of the other thoughts, from moving. But it's still on the same level. At any rate, so what we do is try in a relaxed and open way to accept the sensations of the present moment, primarily in sitting meditation and certainly in Zen, because this kind of meditation, of course, can be done anywhere and, even in the midst of everyday life. But generally speaking, everyday life is always presenting us with situations that we have to respond to. So sitting allows you to try to open yourself up to only about maybe two things, primarily the breathing and, of course, the sensations of the sitting body. Again, this is not something you can do in a day or two, but with repeated practice, your mind can gradually become more comfortable with just resting in the present moment, be more and more comfortable with a state in which it's not compelled to think. I think this type of meditation, very, very basic, learning to be open to and relaxed toward the present moment in the physical sensations, forms the basis, again, as I mentioned before, of all further forms of meditation. Certainly those of Goenka and Shinzen Young, the two that I mentioned. Goenka's technique, for example, generally it's referred to as sweeping. You use the mind to sweep through the body to become aware of physical sensations. His idea is that the physical sensations, since meditation is the investigation of reality, and the bodily sensations you feel, he says, from moment to moment, are the only reality that you can actually experience with no abstractions or conceptualizations. So he puts a big emphasis on sensing the actual physical sensations. But his retreats begin before he goes into that sweeping process with a few days of quiet sitting using a very simplified form of mindfulness, basically, where you concentrate on the sensations of the air coming in and going out of your nose. Because again, once you start focusing on the breathing inside your body, according to what Goenka says. I don't know if I agree with him entirely on this, but as soon as it's inside the body, a certain level of abstraction is inevitably involved. Once you start with his technique, you begin with the top of the head, and you gradually work your way down the body, sweeping the awareness, from the tip of the head down the body, trying to feel whatever sensations are present in the area that you're going through. So your trunk, your shoulders, your arms, down through your legs. According to Goenka, at first you tend to be able to feel only what he calls the gross sensations of pain, itchiness, whatever it is that's kind of on the superficial part of the body. When you get down to your feet, you then start going up the body. According to him, if you continue this meditation, you gradually become able to feel subtler and subtler sensations. And eventually, he says, you get to the point where you can experience the actual vibrations of the human body. The actual vibrations of the molecules, the vibrating molecules that make up your body. This is something that Goenka calls the stage of dissolution. To quote him, in which one experiences the ultimate truth of mind and matter, constantly arising and passing away, constantly arising and passing away, without any solidity. So this is a felt experience of the reality of your own body as an expression of anicca, which he regards as a very liberating experience, because you see that the fact of your own experience, of your own existence, is anicca. He goes on to say something that I found very interesting also, that this is not the final goal. As he explains the process, the sensitivity that we gain in becoming aware of these subtle sensations is something that we can use to see something he calls shankharas. Shankharas are something like, karmic knots, energy knots. He describes them as willful reactions of craving and aversion that arise in response to the sensations we feel. This is kind of similar to the idea, I would guess, to the notion of reactivity in psychology, where someone pushes our buttons and we fly off the handle. But he regards this as an expression of what Buddhism means when they talk about karma. So with the cultivation of this sensitivity towards sensation, we can see these shankharas as they arise. It's like karmic memories that come up. We can greet them with equanimity so that they rise up. And it's kind of a little karmic energy bundle that can rise up and dissipate if we don't react to it and just be gone. And he said, if we continue this process long enough, eventually, as he says, the mind, this leaves the mind open to its essence of peace and compassion. Anyway, one I found very interesting. In contrast to Goenka's approach, Shinzen Young's is more, I think this is much closer. He is someone who has studied a lot of Zen, along with some Vipassana. He kind of combines the two. But he takes mindfulness to a deeper level, not with sensations, as Goenka does, but by observing the thought process. This kind of reminded me, his description, I'll go into it below, but Dogen Zenji's description of Zazen practice in his Fukan Zazengi, his essay on the practice of meditation. He says, stop investigating the words and chasing talk. Learn to step back and turn the light of the mind inwards to illuminate itself. Think of non-thinking. How? Be non-thinking. This is the essential art of Zazen. So in Shinzen's approach, as in Dogen's, thoughts are not suppressed. I think this is something I never really understood because they don't explain stuff in Zen. It's a good point, but Shinzen said, observe thoughts. Don't suppress them. Just whenever they arise, observe them in a state of complete relaxed openness. Now again, this is very, very difficult to do. So he uses a certain system. Again, this is one that I describe, not because it's the only one or the best one, but one that, since I tend to be pretty much in my head, one that I found quite effective. He says that all thoughts, using a process that he calls noting, he says you can categorize. If you have a problem in science, for example, if you can break it down into its constituent parts, the problem becomes much easier to deal with. And you can do this with the problem of thought. Because all thoughts, according to his explanation, are either physical sensations that are strong enough to impose themselves on your consciousness. They are verbal activity, so thought as talk, old songs, whatever it is that comes into your mind as sound, or visual imagery, pictures in your mind, whatever. And he says, just step back, observe your mind, and as a thought comes up, you label it as one of these three, or combinations of these three, or all three together. So thoughts can thus be labeled as either body, image, or talk. So I did a retreat with him, and using his system, a few days into the retreat, we have daily interviews if you want to go in and talk to the teacher. He asked me, how's it going? And I said, well, yeah, I can keep track of the thoughts. I tend to be visual, so I can do the images better. But yeah, it's going okay, I think. So he said, good. And I said, now also be aware of those times when none of these three, body, image, or talk, is present. And you label these times. In other words, you become aware of these times by labeling them as nothing. And be just as open to, aware of, and accepting of these times of nothing as you are of the various thoughts that rise up and dissipate. I noticed that there are these times of natural silence in the thinking process. And I remembered that in an old text, to translate it into English, of course, I can't read Chinese, certainly not very well. But I think it was Han Shan, the Chinese Zen master Han Shan, mentioned something about the importance of being aware of the gaps between thoughts. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I never noticed any gaps between my thoughts, but yes, they're there. And if you can be as aware of and as open to and accepting of, almost like, when you're watching these times of nothingness, as you are watching the times of body, image, and talk, if you can be completely open to that and unresisting, you'll notice that the next thought kind of forms in that state of nothingness. There's like a movement of mind energy. It's as if swirling in water or something. And it sort of rises up, and at some point it forms a thought, and you just let it go. But if you are completely unresisting to that rising of energy, it can rise up and dissipate without ever forming a thought at all. So when Buddhism talks about a tranquil mind or a mind of silence, it's not a matter of, forcing a state of silence on the mind, but of a gradually deepening, opening to the natural silence of the mind is the way it struck me. Anyway, let's see, where am I here? Okay. This state of awareness, which is what I would call it, just open to the present so that thoughts can't catch you, even though the mind still continues to move. I wouldn't regard this as any kind of endpoint in meditation, rather maybe the beginning of true meditation. I think this level of realization, I'm sure probably a number of you have experienced, and certainly I would say was available to anyone in this room. It really is something that, although again, I would not call this is not a Buddha level enlightenment by any means, but even this level of understanding I think can be quite transformative. For example, if we see that our thoughts do not really define who we are, that there is a level of mind that is deeper than thought, that in many ways is much more genuinely what we are as psychic entities, I guess I could call it. It means that you have much less invested in asserting and protecting this mind construct that is the ego. If you see that the narrative, exists on a relatively shallow level of the mind. So this also, I think, makes it much easier to address the mind habits that kind of determine our personality, aspects of ourselves that we may not like. If we know that these are just mind habits and there's a deeper level there, it's much easier to kind of just make new habits. So in this way, I think it can be, this realization can be quite therapeutic. Another thing is that a lot of the havoc that is caused in our private lives, and again, I think this is very much on the same page as psychology, and this is particularly true, I think, in our intimate relationships, is caused because we react instead of respond. Someone pushes our buttons, our spouse kind of pricks our sensitive point. Next thing we know, we say something we regret later. But I think this practice of meditation, where you're observing thoughts, where you learn to see them as they arise, you can use this in everyday life. I mean, again, that little annoying comment or whatever it is, that causes this flash of anger. It starts with just a movement of mind energy, and you can see it at that point. And at that point, it hasn't really become anger yet or anything else. It's just mind energy. And you can do anything you want with that. You can make a joke, you can let it go. You can get angry. Certain situations require anger. I think anyone who's been in charge of running a business knows that. But you are in control of the anger in that case. It's not in control of you. So, again, another thing, I think that I talked about the unavoidable sufferings of life, like old age, sickness, of death, losing those you love. I think particularly death. What really frightens us about death is because we see ourselves as I heard it once expressed, are we not but just the sum total of all our thoughts? Well, what's going to happen to those thoughts when we're dead? This is what concerns us. There was a movie, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, Blade Runner. There was a very famous line in it where sort of in a way the villain, but quite of an understandable person in the end, he's dying and talks to the hero. And I guess you would have to know the movie for this to make much sense. But at any rate, he says, "My eyes have seen things that you people wouldn't believe. I've seen attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I've seen sea beams glittering off the Tannhausen gates. All those memories will be gone like tears in the rain. That's sort of what we're afraid of, isn't it? I mean, if our memories are gone, well, anyway, I think, again, if we realize that there's a level of mind that is deeper than thought, that kind of, I mean, it's not a complete resolution of the problem of death, I think, by any means, but it does reorient us, and I think allows us to approach this inevitable happening in a much different way. Okay, final thing. There's a kind of inherent joy, I think, in being in the present moment. This is something that people that do very dangerous sports will report sometimes. You know, you ask these people why they do things where they're literally risking their lives. And they say that, you know, these are not monk types, you know, but they say, well, because it forces me to be in the present moment. I can't think about, you know, what I had for breakfast this morning or what I'm going to do after I'm finished with this. I have to be completely in the present, and that gives me a rush I can't get anywhere else. I think people that do sports that require very quick reactions, like it can be basketball or soccer, can get into a state they call the zone, you know, which is very much this complete openness to the present moment. Relaxed, a very relaxed and complete openness that allows them to use all of their abilities to their fullest extent. So sometimes I joke that what meditation is kind of aiming for is allowing you to access that state without having to have something outside pulling you into it. Okay, enough for these points. I think there's a final question I would like to take up, which is sort of central, which is, what does Buddhism really mean ultimately when it talks of the resolution of the problem of suffering? Of course, as I mentioned before, I don't think it means the complete elimination of suffering, and I don't think that's even possible. I mean, does a Buddha transcend all suffering and just go off into eternal bliss? I don't think that's what Buddhism is really aiming at. Bodhisattvas, Buddhas. There's a very interesting story, again, one that intrigued me very much, about, I think this is maybe a Tibetan Buddhist story about Amida Buddha and the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, Kuan Yin in Chinese, Kannon in Japanese, where once Amida became a Buddha, he's no longer involved in the world of life and death, so cannot be active in the world, which didn't satisfy him, so he created an emanation of himself, an avatar, in the form of Kuan Yin. And when Kuan Yin came into existence, she looked around and was so profoundly affected by the suffering she saw that her head exploded. And Amida, of course, took pity on her, and he put her head back together, but with 11 faces this time. So she had 11 more pairs of eyes to see even better the suffering in the world, opening up her vision to like 360 degrees. So I think, again, there are a number of ways of interpreting the story, but I see it as an indication that the true resolution of suffering certainly doesn't come from eliminating it, but from accepting it 100%. I think it's precisely because bodhisattvas like Kuan Yin are aware of, understand, and unconditionally accept the suffering of all sentient beings, even those people in hell. That's why they are moved to compassion. Compassion, you know, it means suffering with compassion, and are motivated to liberate all sentient beings. And it's because, I think, they no longer have a self that owns or resists this suffering, and because they have awakened to the ultimate emptiness of all that exists. For that reason, they can know and they can respond to all suffering and accept all suffering, and yet continue their work in the world as liberated beings. There's nothing that tries to possess this, as I could, or resist it. Of course, this is a level of awakening that's far beyond ordinary people, but it's something, it's a direction. I think it indicates a direction in which we should aim. Here again, I do like to cite Shinzen Young because I thought he put it very, very well. He said that Buddhist practice is not a matter of escaping from suffering. Buddhist practice is a matter of escaping into suffering. In meditation, we learn not to negate suffering, but rather to become fully aware of and accepting of it. And because of this open awareness, we are no longer pulling or pushing on experience. So experience takes on a greater fluidity that involves less suffering precisely because we no longer resist it. He has another way of putting it I thought was very, very interesting. What we are learning to do when we have a situation, a new situation, particularly one that we would rather avoid, our reaction tends to be tighten up and turn away. But what we're trying to do in meditation is learn to open up and turn toward. I think even the act of meditation, it is learning to open up and turn toward thoughts. To accept them, and in that, to no longer be trapped by them. I think this openness and acceptance, one question I get that I would sort of like to finish with. People often, this is what's called equanimity in Buddhism. And people often confuse equanimity with not doing anything, passivity. But I think it's exactly the opposite. If you want to act in a positive and transformative way on any given situation, any given person, you first, if you want to do it in a way that is genuinely transformative and genuinely constructive, you first have to unconditionally accept the reality of that situation. And that gives you the firmest basis for knowing what should be done if something needs to be done. You don't do nothing. So meditation can actually make you much more effective, I think, for action in the world in that sense. Okay, there's a bunch of other things. I've sort of reached my time limit. Other things I would like to talk about in my second talk on meditation. Is that going to be the next talk or the last one? Okay, anyway, thank you very much. Okay.
Have you time to answer a few questions from the floor?
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. It was a great talk.
Oh, well, thank you for listening so
any questions
quietly.
from the floor?
How do you make sure that in labeling something, sensation, image, talk, you don't then comment on it and engage with it?
Because you're using words. Yeah.
So the words themselves stop you?
Yeah, it seems to me, my own experience of it is that the kind of labeling, since it's happening in the here and now, doesn't start another train of thought. It's kind of existing on a different level. Again, the thoughts that well up are very much of the past to the future. But when you label it, this is sort of the same, I think, with task-oriented thinking. It's something that sort of occurs in the present, and so it doesn't get you tangled up in more trains of thought that you have to get off of.
Do you have a question?
That would be okay, thank you. I apologise. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. Such clarity, particularly your discussion of the relationship with psychology, the one thing that I saw that the clarity showed was you didn't touch on, you touched on what the no self. What I didn't see is what we should or what we ought to do.
Mm-hmm.
What is, because my understanding of psychology is it has no moral framework,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not my understanding of Buddhism. So how do you resolve that conflict?
Okay, I'm not sure I understood the
Where is the
question.
moral framework in action? I think you're saying, what is the moral framework that informs action?
Yeah, that's of course another very big issue and a very important issue, which can be addressed from the perspective of meditation in several ways. One is that meditation is an enabler. Anything you do, you can do better if you can do it in an aware way, regardless of what it is. Talking to a friend, studying, playing a sport. I mean, this is why Olympic athletes all meditate now. So it is not in itself. It's a practice to develop certain states of mind. And then you can apply these. This is one of the problems with mindfulness, because I start applying it to like business and everything else, and this is where the criticism comes from. And this is a topic I'd like to take up in the next talk. But you can use this, if you're a Christian, for example, to deepen Christianity. A lot of, particularly monks and nuns in contemplative orders, are very interested in Buddhist meditation. And they take the practice and the mind states that are cultivated and apply this to their own structure of work in the world. Another very interesting issue that I don't want to get into deeply, because it's something I want to talk about in my next talk. When you take, I imagine what you're talking about is sort of like the active life. How is all of this applied to the active life? You know, a life in the world and trying to make the world better and trying to help people and things like this. And this is like the vocation of the active orders in the Catholic Church. But the Catholic Church also has contemplative orders, and there's a tension between the two. Just to state it very simply, and it's something that I want to go into in more detail because I think it's very important, is that the active life and the contemplative life, when they are taken to their ideal, which is very, very hard, come together. And the perfect life of action, one that does not expect to be thanked for everything they've done, one that does not experience burnout when they find out that the patients in the hospital do not appreciate them at all. You know, a lot of people burn out when they find this. But the person that can accept that all, as some people can, in a state of equanimity, and this is just part of the path, that's a contemplative life. And on the other hand, again, this is something I'll need a little time to go into more, but I think the path of pure contemplation can reach a point where being becomes action. And there's some interesting incidents, but I'll leave that for next time.
One more question, Diane.
Thank you very much. In Rinzai, great doubt is fundamental, as Hakuin foreshadowed. In what you've given so far, where does great doubt come in, and how does it come into?
Yeah, another very central question. I think the state of awareness, I called it the beginning of true meditation. I think it's very, very important. Without it, you can't, you're just distracted. But is it the end of meditation? No. I heard it expressed, 75 years old, I'm blanking out on something I read very recently. But the essential point was, I mean, the koans, of course, are trying to generate this. But even on a much more general level, you take the state of awareness, and from there you have to go to, who is it that's feeling this? Or you can just end up in a state of clarity. You have, I mean, someone is seeing these things. Someone is behind what's happening. I mean, the awareness of, what is that? You know, and that has to be pursued. And that's also very important. And that's what I would interpret as the great doubt. Yeah.
Yeah, St. Paul said we walk by faith, not by sight.
Uh-huh.
No.
That, okay.
I think we can leave that for today. And there's one more question online.
Online question.
Good.
So someone, Kenjan, who's going to read? Shall I read it for you?
Yeah, read it out.
Okay. The first question is, what do you enjoy most about living at 10 UG?
What do I enjoy most? What I enjoy most is that until quite recently it was a very rural area, which means that Kenruji was able to hold on to a lot of its land, the sub-temples, and that has enabled me to have a lot of space to grow organic vegetables, which is my favorite hobby. That is what I enjoy most. But there's a lot of other stuff that's of great value.
All right. The second question is, I sometimes think that the measure of a training or education process is how much it enhances our capacity to work and our capacity to love. Why does Zen places so much emphasis on the ability to work rather than love?
Yeah. Again, a huge question, I think, and yeah, I've heard it expressed a different way. All of the emphasis is on prajna. I'm sorry, I should. Okay, yeah. In Zen, the emphasis tends to be almost entirely on prajna and nothing on karuna. I suspect that this is partly an artifact of Japanese culture, where the karuna part has sort of been taken care of by Japanese culture in general. It's a culture that stresses thoughtfulness, not bothering other people, what they call miuchi, groups of people that take care of each other. I mean, I have a little group of people that over the decades I've built up and have found jobs for me when I needed them and introduced me to this person and that person. So that aspect is kind of taken care of by Japanese society. And Zen is more free to focus on the prajna part. Whereas it's rather different in Chinese Buddhism, I think, or other forms of Buddhism. And I think that's one thing that's going to have to change as Zen comes to the West. That's a short answer, but a partial answer.
There's another one there. I think it's, thank you for your lecture on suffering. My question is, as a grieving mother, how can I be identified selfless, formless, not to be mom to my son Avi, who met his spiritual journey in November 13, 2024. I'm suffering and want to navigate my suffering to help me cope with my great loss. Thank you.
Well, yeah, I think, of course, the important first thing to be aware of is that it's entirely natural to grieve the loss of a child. I mean, if you didn't, there would be something strange, so it's a very, very natural reaction. Vipassana would say if you want to work with this, see what it's doing to you. I mean, I'm a little cautious about this approach, I must say, but Vipassana, I think, would say, once you've dealt to some extent with your grieving and accepted it as perfectly natural, then you can start using it for deeper self-understanding. When I grieve, I feel certain feelings in my body. What are these feelings and reactions trying to make me think? What kind of thoughts are they trying to generate in my mind? Where do I feel them in my body? So they can be used as a kind of method to stay in the present moment. But if this leads to a kind of rejection of the grieving process, I think it's not healthy. Should be left for later. Yeah. And talking to people, just if you have a circle of friends that you can talk to, I think we're social beings, so I think that's important too. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Should I end with, I just remembered now that you had requested that I start with a short chanting or something. So maybe I should end with a short, or next time. Okay, we'll do it next time.
When you start.
We can end with it too, Tom. We
sorry?
can end with it.
Okay, well, I could do the 4 vows,
Yeah.
which will be over very quickly. So, okay, ja. Shujō buhen seigan dobon no mujin seigan dan homon muryo seigan akubutsu do jo seigan byo shujō buhen seigan dobon no mujin seigan dan homon 무료 세간 아쿠부츠도 묘 세간조 시조 무엔 세간도 본노 무진 세간다 오몬 무료 세